Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Praveen Kankaria, CEO of Impetus. I want to start with a question. How many of you know of Fannie Mae? Pretty much everybody. If I may ask a personal question, how many of you own homes? Single-family homes, largely? So it's quite likely that your home's mortgage was eventually backed up and turned into a mortgage security by Fannie Mae. How many of you know what Fannie Mae stands for? Don't mind my saying, but it's a little boring name. Federal National Mortgage Association. So it's a government-sponsored enterprise, right? GS.
Yes.
And Fannie Mae was started by the government to help turn our mortgages into security so that the mortgage market became an efficient, liquid market. So every time you and I buy a home and we draw a mortgage, the mortgage is sold by the issuing bank, likely in this liquid marketplace. It's turned into a security. It's traded on a daily basis, what have you. And Fannie Mae is a very essential central core of this process. This has actually turned the American mortgage market into one of the most efficient marketplaces. I've traveled around the world, and our mortgage process is the most efficient on the planet for its scale. And my company is privileged to be working with Fannie Mae on some of its big data initiatives. And I want to make an admission. When we began engaging with them, I had very low expectations. Sorry, no offense.
None taken.
I mean, I thought I'm dealing with the government, the federal government. It's sort of like one part of federal government. And I grew up in a highly bureaucratic country full of red tape. And so I, of course, carried that impression. I carried that impression over, and I thought, wow, this will be a struggle to work with. We don't know how to work with the government. We've not done extensive RFPs and whatnot. And then we engaged, and what I found was just another smart group of people working like a regular, fairly fast-moving enterprise for its size. And it's been a phenomenal journey together. I'm happy and honored to be introducing Kevin Bates. He is the Vice President of Enterprise Data Strategy and Execution at Fannie Mae. So in short, I'll reduce the fancy title to, he's responsible for a lot of the innovation around big data. And there's some amazing things that they're doing. So without further ado, Kevin.
Thank you, Praveen, for the very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I hope you just drank a bunch of coffee and you're all charged up and ready to contribute. Love to have a dialogue. Any questions you have, please go ahead and shout them out, or I think there's a microphone there. I have a few slides, maybe 10 or 15 slides. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to kind of speak to them a bit more. I'm not going to read what's up there. And I thought I would start by rehashing a little what Praveen was saying. I work for Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae is in the business of what we call, injecting liquidity into the secondary mortgage market. So the primary mortgage market is the market where people go to local banks and they get a mortgage, and so they can go buy a house. The secondary market is the market that ensures that those banks that give you the mortgage have access to liquid funds. As you can imagine, small banks in Anchorage, Alaska might not have readily local sources of a great deal of liquid money. So Fannie Mae was created as part of the New Deal back in, I think, 1938, 80 years ago. We just celebrated our 80th anniversary, partly to ensure that the American economy was healthy in terms of home ownership, the ability to buy a home, regardless of where you live, what you do, as long as you are a qualified borrower. So Fannie Mae essentially buys mortgages from the lenders out there that are giving mortgages to homeowners, bundles them up into this thing we call a mortgage-backed security, sells that on the to investors around the world, foreign governments, mutual funds, any investors. Is what we call a fixed income security. So it's intended to be a conservative investment, very similar, not very similar, identical to a bond. So long and short of it, that's what Fannie Mae does. It's a huge engine, as Praveen mentioned. It's an engine that we have essentially $3 trillion worth of mortgages that we manage through this process on a revolving basis. He also mentioned we're a government-sponsored enterprise. We have direct access to the Treasury, which is how we achieve the scale that we have. We ensure that the Treasury provides this liquidity to the entire mortgage market. We operate in two business lines. One is the single-family homes. So these are the homes that you guys own and live in. Also, if you happen to live in an apartment, we do have a smaller portion of our business is called a multifamily business, and that tends to focus on large-scale apartment complexes in particular areas of the country. So both of these lines of business are essentially everything that we do. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit here is taking on that journey from our journey where we have been looking at how we do what we do, how we can manage that better, how we can leverage new technologies like the cloud and so forth to move it forward. So that was just a little bit of background to make sure you're grounded. Also, as Praveen mentioned, my role is with the Enterprise Data Organization. So it is a technology, delivery, and operations kind of role. Enterprise data is a centralized, as it implies, team that is ensuring that the data that we ship around our company is consistent, standardized, aggregated in an effective way, and made available to all of our different business lines so that we're managing our risk and reporting our finances and running our operations, all of that based on the same standardized set of data. So my job as strategy execution is really, we have a strategy for how we want to do that. We have a data strategy at our company, and we want to execute on that strategy. We don't want to have different strategies. We want to be consistent and execute on that one strategy. So I'm going to talk a little about how we're working toward migrating analytics to the cloud. So I wanted to take a few minutes and go over what we mean when we talk about analytics, an overview of the kinds of analytics that we do, really in business terms. This is, although I'm coming from the technology organization, this is much more business oriented than some of the other presentations I've seen today. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means in plain English. Then we'll talk a little about why we're looking to migrate toward the cloud, what's in it for us, why are we doing it, what approach we're taking as we go along is sort of a try and learn approach, and I'll try to describe that. Very consistent with what I've heard from peers that I've bumped into at this conference and others like it. And then go over the challenges and the things that we've learned along the way. My hope is that this triggers some thoughts with you guys. Maybe you have questions, or maybe you've seen the same things. So that's what we're going to go over, and I'll just kind of dig in. Again, I'll encourage you to just ask a question. If you have one, raise your hand, and I'll stop. At a high level, analytics at Fannie Mae, it could describe any number of things, but as I mentioned, we buy mortgages, so these are loans. We create securities. That's another kind of an entity that we manage, and we sell these things on the open market. So we're very involved in the U.S. economy, in the market, whether it's in the mortgage market, buying loans, pricing them, doing the kinds of transactions you would have with a bank to come to agreement on how we're going to do that. Or it could be on the investment side, where our securities are considered a gold standard around the world, and it injects a tremendous amount of liquidity into the U.S. economy. Our ability to package up the loans of all the the American home buyers, which is considered to be a really good bet that these people are going to pay off their loans, very hardworking and largely blemish-free group of people in terms of their ability to pay. So that means these bonds tend to pay the investors that buy them. So when we think about what kind of analytics we can do to manage that, you can think about market risk. So we exist in multiple different aspects of the market where there can be significant changes in interest rates. We can go through something like the crisis that we had 10 years ago. There have been many crises, not of that scale, but as we go along. And these are market conditions that we don't necessarily control. So we need to do analytics that allow us to describe the risk that we're operating at, what we want to do in certain scenarios. So you can think about stress testing, shocking, analytics that are essentially shocking your system to see how your portfolio would perform. Again, $3 trillion roughly. I think that comes and goes, but up and down. But it's been between $2 and $3 trillion for the last 10, 15 years. So you're talking about a very large book of business that you're managing, and you want to understand how it's going to perform so that when the next crisis comes, we'll be ready. From the financials perspective, that's another flavor of analytics that we do that is largely about how we report our earnings. So we are a publicly held company, been through some changes as we went into conservatorship. You guys may know that. After the crisis, we were taken under the FHFA conservator. We are still operating as a public company, but in a slightly revised form. But when we report our financials, we need to be able to report the money that went in and out, but we also need to be able to characterize the value of illiquid assets that we have on our books. That's a very big part of our operations. So financials, there's a form of analytics that you need to do to describe that, and then again, also look at what happens in different scenarios for different reasons. Analytics are also largely used when we want to think about new products. So in the context of Fannie Mae, a new product is when we work with for example, a partner like a Wells Fargo, and we design a new flavor of a mortgage that we think addresses a particular niche that's important, an underserved community, what have you. Those ideas are things that we come up with every day, but in order for us to move forward, we need to have some reasonable understanding of what the results will be if we're going to move into a new product. From the Fannie Mae perspective, we want to characterize it, and analytics is one important tool for doing that. Pricing is more an art than a science. We try to collect all the data we can from our customers and the way that we price mortgages. So there is the concept of loan pricing. So how much of a fee, for example, would be associated with us taking over a loan for a bank or a very large group of loans, which is more often the case. But also on the security side, how do we price our securities? How do we make sure that we're operating profitably, and so forth? So pricing is an area of heavy analytics use. And then measuring progress. So really that's intended to be very generic, but one of the reasons for analytics is that you want to know what happened. You want to be able to look back and describe what may have happened in the past. You want to be able to predict a little bit what would happen in the future. Let's say if interest rates dipped by 1% or went up by 2%. You want to be able to predict that and have really strong financial models that help you do that, which is certainly within what we consider analytics. But then you even want to get prescriptive, so you want to start using analytics to drive decisions that you make as a business and to guide you down the path. So data is everything at Fannie Mae, as with most companies. We are essentially a monoline business, though. What we do is around these mortgages and these securities. So we want to have a very complete, robust set of analytics that help us describe what's happened, predict what's going to happen, and also guide us as we move forward and take more risks and try to do other things to serve the American home buyer. So I included here a little kind of a wheel chart. There's typically a life cycle of analytics at any company, Fannie Mae not being any different, but you're using your analytics to do analysis, to do modeling and optimization. I'm starting kind of on the right, the right-hand side and going around. Monitoring, alerts, responding, and there's sort of a feedback cycle. So your analytics will be continually improved by the processes that you have. So think of it as I'm making certain decisions. The analytics told me it would look like this. I put those decisions into practice. The data starts coming in from the marketplace in terms of the prices and the profitability or the performance of certain assets, and that information gets folded back into our process. So that's what we mean by analytics at Fannie Mae. Does that make sense to everybody here? So good, I see people shaking their heads, so that's perfect. But ultimately, keep this in mind. I think any mature company that's been around a while, we've been around 80 years, this is going into kind of a golden period, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So why migrate this analytics to the cloud? I should just say that for the last 40 years, we've had mainframes and on-premise data platforms that are just big, servers, whether they're Oracle servers or maybe we, like I say, had a few mainframes in there, and they were working just fine. They have matured over the years. We have the applications that we know and love running on those systems. We're all very familiar with how the data flows, with how those systems behave. So why are we thinking about migrating our analytics to the cloud? Are we just chasing a shiny object, or is there kind of a business objective that we have in mind? So obviously we don't want to make significant changes that are quite disruptive for no reason. I listed here a few things that are really the motivating factors for this transition, really trying to keep it very simple, but opportunities to empower new and old capabilities. The reason I say that, and I heard it at a couple of talks earlier today as well, there are ideas out there like artificial intelligence and machine learning that have they've been around for 40 years. A lot of this stuff has been around since Alan Turing, invented some of these things many, many, many years ago. They were constrained by the hardware that we have to manage and support, by storage, by the amount of compute you have available to you, and many of us going through school, ran into those constraints because you would be trying to do some kind of project in physics where you were doing a big calculation, and there would just be a limit to how much you could do. With the cloud, and somewhat as advertised, it's not always flawlessly true, but you essentially have limitless storage. You essentially have limitless capacity to do computations. So that means that some of the old, well-established ideas that were constrained by hardware are now not constrained. So that's one reason. And then the new capabilities, you'll see a lot of things in here, chatbots and fintech, and there's a constant evolution of products and tools out there that I personally in my career seen very, very much driven by the cloud. The minute the cloud became available, now I'm using Amazon's cloud, and I will just have availability at my fingertips to adopt new tools, to try new things out at a very, very low transaction cost, I would say, a very low barrier to us trying a new product or a new type of compute, or hey, there's a cluster that has GPUs available and I can just grab it and try it out. All I'm going to see is a bill that comes in every month, corresponding to my storage and my compute. But there's new ideas, there's old ideas that are being empowered by this new paradigm where storage and compute are not really limited. So that's one good reason that we cannot ignore the cloud and just stay in our shell and say, hey, it kind of works and it could be better, but we're okay. Another one, and I touched on this a little bit, with that explosion in tools, it also comes a change in the way we think about the tools we use. Many of us may have, if you have some, 10 years of experience, you'd go back. There was a time that we would very much try to limit the number of BI tools, for example, that our business users were using. We would say, hey, I don't want you to take, pick two. You can have Tableau and you can have business objects, but you can't just, go buy your own tool left and right, because I have to maintain that thing. There's licensing and it needs to go on dedicated servers, and we have to get our process in place. And all of that's a lot of work, and I only have 5 people. So that was really the status that you had pre-cloud. Now when you're in the cloud, you're managing. That's no longer the case. I don't have to manage all this stuff. So I also should not be slapping the hands of my business consumers. I want to delight these people. One of our objectives is to deliver a very high quality of service, allow our business partners to innovate, and support them in their innovation and their attempts. So the idea of this is really just to show that you have many different tools, and they're kind of grayed out the specific names of tools, and it's not any one, you see Hortonworks, which is certainly you've been seeing at this conference a lot, but all of them come into different categories of work, and those categories haven't changed. We're still doing those things, but the tools that enable those categories of work are constantly evolving, and there's a new one out every week. So do we want to be in a situation that we make ourselves able to take advantage of that, or do we want to shut the door on that? So in the case of Fannie Mae, we strive to be innovative. We try to come up with ways to compete against our competitors out there, and so being innovative, taking on new tools, making sure we understand what it means to us is very important. Another driving force behind cloud adoption, opportunities to drive efficiency and to share. Again, going back to the constraints that you have when you're managing your own data center, there's a significant amount of overhead to taking a server that's been supporting a certain product or certain database, and then saying, okay, now I'm going to share that, and I don't want to duplicate. I want 2 different groups to come together and figure out how they're going to work off of that same platform. It's a very difficult thing to manage, and typically it doesn't get done. And what you have is, if you look from left to right here, you can have many different projects that come up where your analytics partners are going to follow the very similar pattern. They're going to find out what data they want, connect to it, join it together, massage it, make it look the way they'd like it to look, create new calculations or new analytics or new application, whatever it is, and then deliver that into whatever business use they had in mind, make it operational. And then you'll have another team that's doing something with maybe 80 to 90% overlap of that. They're almost the same data, but a slightly different flavor of it, going through the same process. And you end up with many different siloed kind of threads of activity within a large enterprise that's innovative. So we have a lot of people with a lot of energy doing these things. Another opportunity that comes out of removing these constraints on storage and compute is the age-old idea that I would not have my analytics partners move the data and customize the data, that they can take the data where it sits, they can create something that has more value to them, but they can also make it available to 100 other people that are in that same environment, and so they can share. And if they can share, then they can avoid all of the duplication, all the storage duplication. Storage may not be expensive anymore, but it's still interesting that you can have an organization like Fannie Mae where 30 terabytes is pretty much the complete data set of the firm, yet you have petabytes worth of data, floating around. That happens because people are copying and copying and copying. So one of the opportunities we have is to bring in a new class of tools, leveraging the fact that we can create a well-organized data lake. I'll talk a little about that, but it can be implemented and hosted in the cloud where you don't have these constraints, and you can allow users to share with one another and drive efficiency, and even make it easier than doing it the old way. So the idea would actually to be create incentives that actually are self-reinforcing, and that you can get to a more efficient place, a more well-governed place, by removing these constraints that we had in the past around hardware that caused us to kind of branch and create new versions of things, highly duplicative process. So I really wanted to show the concept of analytic reuse. So that's the idea that people can share, they can create analytics, value-added preparations of data, and then reuse them, extend them, keep track of them so that we actually know what we have. So those are really the reasons that we wanted to jump in, and I think it's fairly straightforward, and it's not overly ambitious. We're just saying here's a set of constraints. We're unshackled now. There are certain things that we've always wanted to do, and now we have an opportunity to do them. That said, we didn't want to go whole hog into just shoving everything willy-nilly out into the cloud, building a data lake, and having it fall out of governance. So we wanted to have a measured approach. So Fannie Mae has been looking at different technologies over the years. So we started really in 2014. That was the first time that we really said, hey, there's this thing out there. It's big data, it's Hadoop, it's whatever. So we started in 2014 with a open source Hadoop, moved into using an analytics cluster. So you can see each year we were kind of getting a little more sophisticated or moving with what we thought was more optimal for us. We were at that point using a proprietary Hadoop distribution, which had its great benefits. They're managing kind of against an open source set of technologies that are changing constantly. So having somebody that will give you a distribution has a lot of value. Then we moved into having a formalized data lake. We realized, remember, I'm from the enterprise data group, so if we're going to have commonly shared data, we want to apply all the same principles of governance that we care about for our on-prem systems. We want to have the same level of insight to ensure that the data that we are making available for creating applications is high quality, it's vetted, it's been signed off, etc. Obviously, we don't want to stifle innovation, so when you think about a data lake, you also have sort of a federated development capability where people come in, they'll have access to our core data, which will be highly governed, but they can bring in third-party data sets and other things, and as long as they follow the right kind of governance, there's no problem with that. So we then moved toward using native technologies for a variety of different reasons, which if anybody's interested, I could talk more about. So where we find ourselves now is we have a set of patterns that work for us, a set of technology choices that we've made that we feel are sustainable, and that we are going to sort of start driving adoption, working with our business partners to make sure that there's sort of a well-established reason and what's in it for them as they move forward. They understand what's available by using our data lake and using the cloud, what the trade-offs might be, and so forth. So Fannie Mae is not new to data lakes or the cloud. We've been doing it for quite some years, but we've been trying and learning and tweaking our approach as we went. So taking a governance view, you may not be able, well, it's pretty big up on this screen, so I think you can read it. But we understood very early on that you have to keep very careful track of what you're ingesting into. I'm going to be talking more about the data lake perspective, which is leveraging the cloud. But when we bring in data, we need to keep track of what we brought in. It's as simple as that. And so you can see we'll have a lot of transactional data from our systems. We'll have, thank you. We'll have third-party data, reference data, so forth. We have to keep track of what's going in. When we process it, we need to know what processes are in place, how we're processing it, and if it's creating something that is derivative of the data that went in, we have to have some formal governance around that. And then who's consuming it? So we do have a basic set of controls, and our approach was to take a governance view early on before we went too far. Approach number 2 here, think about personas. Before we go into this work, this is actually related to engaging with our business partners as well. Think about who's going to be using this. We'll have developers in the platform, so we need certain capabilities that enable them and certain rules of the road and guidelines that help them. But we also will have business users, and we'll have empowered data scientists that are really, really good at manipulating data and pretty darn technical. And we'll have people that are more operational analysts that are less technical, but they do know how to do querying. So we have personas that we have to support. And before we go too far, we actually want to think that through. So that was critical to our process. Approach number 3, how can we bring two worlds together? So this goes back a little bit to the opportunity we have now that we may not have had in the past, which is that you have business transactional applications throughout your firm that have been around quite some time, and they're generating actual business data. And those systems are highly controlled. They go through the full software development lifecycle. You know, if you talk to a business person, they'll say, "Yeah, making updates to those systems is slow. You know, we're agile, we're getting faster, but it's still slow compared to the needs of a data scientist who got a call from the EVP and he needs to get some answer back to him today." They need immediate ability to manipulate data. So we have, if you look on the bottom of this picture, we have the systems that are going through a very controlled software development lifecycle. And on the top, we have the business analytics, where they're creating applications, derivations, they're doing BI, where they need self-service data, essentially. And what's in between there is a data collaboration platform. And so when we think about our data lake, we're thinking about a collaboration platform where we'll have a centralized data catalog, we'll have some abilities to federate, and the idea would be bring these two worlds together and don't break lineage anymore. So that's an opportunity. That's a huge, what you would call kind of an audacious goal, which is in the past, your analytics consumer would slurp the data over to wherever they wanted to do their thing, and you really didn't know what happened after that. What we want to get to is a world where, with just the same level of effort, they can do it all in place without breaking lineage, within the same kind of what I call implied governance paradigm, and they can get the best of both worlds. And then the last one, and I won't take a lot of time because it looks like I only have about 8 minutes left, but it's a new evolving thing. We want to leverage partners that know this stuff. So in this case, Impetus Praveen introduced me is an example of such a partner, and I'll talk for a minute about that. But ultimately, this is a new evolving platform. It's a whole new set of capabilities. You really have to go through rigor and repeat, try again, and then repeat. You still want to deliver value. You don't want to just spend forever just sort of working things out. Your business would never tolerate that. But be realistic. You know, we had a use case here working with Impetus where we needed some new patterns for data movement. We needed to go to a hybrid model for essentially large warehouses that were on premises for 40 years old, and we need to move to a world where we're going to have full hybrid. So we're going to transform those legacy systems into our target state systems on premises and in the cloud. And we need patterns that will allow that. So the use case here was really around cloud transition and retirement and hybrid at the same time, giving me full production context. So I don't want to do this as a tinker toy or as a prototype that really didn't incorporate the complexity of a mature company. We wanted to do this in a way that was real, that would give us something that we could put into production, that we could repeat and build on. So as we see here, establishing the data extraction and ingestion framework, the job orchestration, the transformation, change capture, the audit framework, that's very important. So any financial company, it may not be the most interesting subject, but it's actually quite critical. And then capturing all of that as reusable utilities and libraries that we can extend and move and build on. So approach number 4 is very important. It's new, it's evolving. Choose a partner that can help you establish basic patterns, figure out, do you want to own this, so you need a partner to just kind of help you figure it out, or do you need a longer term partner that you'd like to do it? So that was key to our approach and something that we feel very good about. I'll take a few minutes and then I can open it up for questions, but you can imagine in this there were a lot of challenges, and I list a lot of them here. Obviously moving to the cloud and these technologies, there's a lot of command line level stuff, and you thought you'd moved away from this because everybody's been using ab initio or Informatica to move data. Now you're opening up a world where you need to bring back people that can do command line shell scripting, and at least some people that will set up the platform. keeping track of your data and the lineage is a whole new stack, but all the rules still apply. That's a very important point. If you're managing a process that has SOX compliance relevance, there's no reason you can't use the cloud for that process, but you have to replicate all the same controls and all the same features that made this a valid process in the first place. Operationalizing is always a challenge with a new technology and a new stack. I won't read all of these off. It'll be made available, I think, to folks. But I'm going to emphasize the last one. Business awareness and buy-in is critical. Your business partners, a lot of this is very technical, and all the selling points that I mentioned earlier about the cloud are largely technical. You have to show them the other selling points around availability of new tools, around how things can get faster, how they won't be constrained, and they need to buy in, or else you're going to find you go through a whole lot of work and come to a solution that's unacceptable. A couple of key things that we learned here: review your development practices and think about it holistically. So I mentioned the work we did with Impetus was very much an end-to-end kind of practice, because you need to think through all of that. You don't want people to lift and shift their applications over to the cloud thinking, oh, I'll just move the same thing over there. No, you really need to rethink the architecture and the design. You're using a different technology platform. Think governance first. That's important, and I touched on it. If you're a company that does business, you're going to have governance. Engage strategic partners where it makes sense and figure out what you think that is. I touched on business on business engagement. As the center of gravity moves toward the cloud, having a hybrid strategy is important. We started really with that, knowing that we would be hybrid. So if that's where things are going, it's not just about the cloud, it's actually about the hybrid, and having you don't want to have duplication, you don't want to have processes that are creating two different versions of the truth. That's the world we're trying to get away from. It will take time. I showed 4 years. We've made a lot of progress, but a lot of it feels like you're kicking the tires and you're trying things out, and you're actually not afraid to say that something failed and we're going to try again. And don't do it for tech reasons. I think I've hit on that quite a bit. So with that, I have maybe just a few minutes. I'll just stop if anybody has a question or yes.
We all sort of live under budgetary fascism. So
Yes.
how did you make a cost benefits argument, or is there one that was made? How was it assessed, estimated?
Excellent question. So first, it's just figuring out what it's going to cost is important, but it's an excellent question, because when we started off the program I mentioned around retiring these platforms, it was a multi-year effort, and we weren't thinking hybrid cloud too. That came in a little later, where we realized we'd have to do that. So in our case, because we're a centralized data provisioning platform, the mere fact that business applications that feed into or consume out of our platform were moving to the cloud answered the question that we have no choice. We have to be hybrid cloud. The business case for cloud adoption often is not about money. It's actually about security or resilience, or something more around operational stability. So in our case, looking at the business case, I think it was really about that. You don't want to go in and say this isn't going to be expensive, especially because you may have 3 years it takes to retire an application, and now I'm building it out in the cloud because that's my target state, but in the 3 years interim, I'm paying for both. So I actually do not have a positive ROI. It's only after I've done the full retirement that you should start seeing some return. So it's a great question. You have to think it through, and my time's up. So any other quick questions?
How did you manage? How did you manage PII and PCI data, moving it from on-prem to
Yes, so great question. So we started off by not doing that at all. So if you have social security numbers and that sort of thing, unless we had a really strong reason we needed to move it, we didn't move it.
And I have another question.
Yes, go ahead. Just yell it out, it's fine.
We'll come up after session.
Okay, sure.
I want to make sure rest of them have.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
You had Snowflake in the picture, right?
Yes.
The role, is it any specific use case specific?
So Snowflake and Redshift, they have slightly different use cases that they support. Back to my comment about not constraining yourself, we find ourselves in the situation that one application feels that Snowflake is better for their particular data use cases, and in others, Redshift makes more sense. And so the question is, do you make them pick? Nowadays, it's really if you want to pay for it and it's available there, I don't have to manage it. So I guess so. We're open, and we're keeping our minds pretty open there.
So,
Yes. Name a few things I would do differently if I repeat the journey. I think it was really it was a very agile thing, and so if anything, I would say even being more just try things and quickly learn from that and shift your. We probably in some cases spent a year trying to get a particular tool to work to come to a conclusion that it wasn't going to work or it wasn't economic. So back to the other point, some of the stuff we built out early on turned out to be very expensive, and then we spent the next year trying to retire that because somebody was already using it now, while we build out what we really think the target state should be. So I think also the business engagement, part of the reason I highlighted it so much here, I think we're all guilty that sometimes you look up and say, oh, wait a minute, I need to engage the business, but it's very important to do it up front. So up front, this was much more of a technology exploration idea, and then we realized that we've actually gone into making it real before we went back and made sure the business was with us and kind of on board and understood what it meant to them. So that was an important point that I'd say I would reemphasize that if I went back and started over.
What, can I ask another question?
Yes.
What percentage of your data, from these platforms that you were migrating off of, what percentage would you say you actually migrated to the cloud?
Great question. So as we speak right now, it would probably be about half or 30% or something like that. So we're doing it incrementally. We have been building a centralized platform, as I mentioned, like folding all of our legacy assets into this one place to shop on-prem. And then about 2 years into that, we started recognizing we had to be hybrid. So what we're doing is, as we identify use cases that must be available in the cloud as a service or whatever, we started moving it over. So it'll be sort of like that from now on. And ultimately, target state, we think that we'll probably have more in the cloud and less on-prem, because that's part of the reason we're moving into the cloud. But yeah, it's a work in progress.
We could sit here and ask you questions probably for the next 30
sure.
minutes. So
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.